Okay, just give it a minute for all the attendees to get in here and get comfortable. Welcome, everyone. I see the numbers still rising a bit. Okay. All right, so let's get going. Welcome to our webinar here on Not Your Average Reserve Fund. This is being presented by CAI Canada, and here are our sponsors. So we've got Condo Management Group is sponsoring today's talk, and of course, I always leave the Community Association Institute Canada chapter logo there as thanks for hosting it. Next page, John. So today we're going to have Jon Juffs from Macintosh Perry. He'll be giving a presentation on the reserve fund study work he's been doing. So he's, you can see here, Director of Facility Assessment and Restoration. He's got lots of condominium involvement. He's been doing reserve fund stuff for a long time, I think is fair to say. And if you want to get in touch with him, he's got his fancy little ticker at the bottom of his screen there too. So, which I forgot. I was going to look into how to get one of those for myself.
Careful what you wish for.
Yeah. So we were going to have Shelley Seavey with us today. Unfortunately, she sends her regrets. She's feeling under the weather and can't make it. And Shelley never really misses anything. So if she says she's feeling under the weather, she must be really under the weather. So hopefully she's better soon. And then there's myself. And I decided to lighten it up with the picture of my daughter. I figured that that would get the mood going. So even if the rest of the presentation was dull, hey, look at that, a cute kid.
Yeah, if I bomb out, we can always remember the cute kid.
Yeah, there we go. Just go back to that slide. All right. So with that, I will turn it over to you, John, to begin your presentation.
Thank you very much, Gerry, and welcome everyone, and thank you for your time today. A big shout out, really. I do this as often as I possibly can, and some of you have probably heard it directly from me, but a big shout out to our property management professionals who, during this pandemic, became essential services and have been working day, night, and weekends to make sure communities are operating and operating safely. And quite frankly, without property managers, we wouldn't have many of the communities that we do have. And so, thank you very much to all the property managers in the audience. It's difficult at the best of times, and then you toss a pandemic on top of it. You guys came through with flying colors, so thank you very much. We're here to talk about reserve fund planning and some of the things that I've been researching over the years, and I've been doing this since 1988, before there was even mandatory reserve fund planning in most provinces and territories. And of course, that has changed a fair bit. And one of the most recent things we've done is looked at and worked with the Canadian Institute of Actuaries, the other CIA, and they are great at twisting and torturing data. And so, I had a lot of data, but didn't have the time to twist and torture it. And not that they had the time either, they're pretty busy, but they committed to it. So we came up with a few interesting things. And one of them I'll share right away, right off the get-go, is, how the provinces and territories now rank in about 2021, because the report was published in February of 2022. So a lot of this data was gathered in 2021. So, here the various provinces and territories are ranked. And we looked at a number of things. Like, did the legislation even call for a reserve fund study or a depreciation report in the case of BC? Did they lay out who can conduct them, how frequently they should be, were there any minimums established and things like that. And as you can see, the best, so to speak, ranked one was Ontario, but even that's only 77% of what we felt we needed to have in all of those criteria. Obviously, places like Nunavut don't really have condos, and so they do have condo legislation, but they don't really call for much in the way of reserve fund planning in their legislation. They'll probably do it for regulations when the time comes. Newfoundland, Labrador, Quebec, Manitoba, Northwest Territories, Yukon, and even Alberta all have very similar scores. Good, but not great. We think there's certainly room for improvement. And then you get into places like BC, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and New Brunswick, who score a little bit better because they do, actually legislate, mandate, how reserve fund planning should be done. So it's kind of an interesting exercise, and you can find all the explanation for that in the actual report itself when you go to the Canadian Institute of Actuaries reports. It's a free download. I think I have the link to it here in the slide, and of course everybody will get that distributed afterwards. One of the things maybe we should mention is if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box in the Zoom box at the bottom of the screen, or at least on my screen anyway, it's at the bottom. There's a Q&A section. You can ask your questions there, and Gerry and I will do our best to monitor those and get you some answers. For those of you from Ontario, you'll see that I'm going to be heavily weighted on that big green blob on the map that I just showed you. A lot of these things are direct quotes from the Ontario legislation, and that they are very similar where there is legislation across the country. Some things might change, like the number of years or the frequency of doing a study, and that sort of thing, or who the prescribed people are. But it doesn't change dramatically, so we'll stay focused on that. Plus, that's where I do most of my work, and so I have it down pretty pat, and I would have to think a little bit harder about out of Ontario responses, but I could still do it. So a reserve fund, it's an asset to the corporation, and that asset is either physical or financial. The fund itself is financial, and it is related to all of the physical assets. Anytime you have a reserve fund in pretty much every legislative body across Canada, it is a restricted fund. It's solely for the use of repair and replacement of common elements, the physical assets of the corporation. There are a couple exceptions here and there. For example, Ontario has an exception where electric vehicle charging stations, which may not exist in the common elements at the time, reserve funds can be used to install one. And other provinces have a couple similar kind of accommodations for things that may not actually be currently in the common elements of the corporation, but are required for the health and safety or green energy type stuff. Generally speaking, across the country, major is the word used. In Ontario, that's anything greater than $500 under the regulations to the Act. And bear in mind, the regulations were back in 2001 to 4 sort of time frame, a couple changes here and there. I think that $500 is the absolute minimum. I think it should be raised a little bit. It's pretty hard to even replace a front door for $500 these days. And then minimum time frames. Almost every piece of legislation has 30 years. I think one of them has 25. Might be one of the maritime provinces. And then, but all the rest are 30 years. And there's a movement afoot here in Ontario to change that to a minimum of 45 years. And the plans I work on actually have a minimum of 60 years. And I think that's reasonable for the simple reason that condominium corporations in Canada have been registered since 1967. The first ones in Ontario were late 67, but there was an Alberta one in early 67. So I believe it was in Edmonton. So those sorts of things, speak to the fact that condos are already approaching 50 years old, and we want to develop long-term plans. Well, imagine if in the beginning we had long-term plans, a lot of things would have been very different. So here we are looking at maybe a new beginning for reserve fund planning in condos. What else is a reserve fund? Well, it's not just a financial asset reported on by most auditors. In Ontario, there's particular sections that pertain to it, and these are section references from the Ontario legislation, but the other provinces have similar sections, and usually just as brief, 1 or 2 sections that actually refer to reserve fund planning. It's also a perception thing. Let's face it, if you have money in the bank as a corporation, people perceive that as an overall indication of well-being. Now, you do have to take that with a grain of salt. You might have no money in the bank, but the building is in perfect condition. That would be ideal. In other words, the money that you collected had been spent to actually keep your common element assets in good condition. Now, that never happens, of course. Thankfully, you always have some money in the bank. Most, if not all, studies are usually independent and by prescribed persons conduct the study. and most have to be followed. Now, there are some exceptions here and there, like the Strata Corporations Act in BC does allow corporations to receive the study but not implement it. The owners, if you will, the strata property owners can vote not to implement the study or not to have the recommendations and keep their contributions low. And you see headlines every once in a while from those legislations that do have the opt into it, that they usually have a corporation in trouble here or there. Not to say that others don't. I mean, we've had headlines recently in Ontario where an older condominium corporation was just quite simply broke, and even the administrator was sort of throwing up their hands saying, the money has to be collected to do the work. So we'll see how that goes. Thankfully, those are pretty rare. In Ontario, I'll just remind the audience that there are 3 types of studies. There's the Class 1 type, which is done within the first year of registration, hopefully. The Class 2 type, which is also with a site visit, and it has to be done within 3 years of a Class 3 study. And then the Class 3 study, which is without a site visit, and has to be done within 3 years of a Class 2 study. So they rotate between Classes 2 and 3 after the first one's done. Also done by prescribed people. Some provinces will extend that to 5 years. And I believe Alberta is an example of a 5-year cycle, maybe New Brunswick. So 5-year cycles. And if you look at the Condominium Authority of Ontario website, they have this nice little graphic that talks about comprehensive 3 years or less do a Class 3, and then 3 years or less do a Class 2, and then repeat every 3 years. So that's a kind of neat little graphic, and that can come in handy if you're explaining things to a board of directors or a property management group. In Ontario again, and for the most part, this is typical across the legislative bodies that do have prescribed people who can actually conduct a reserve fund study. It usually starts with the big 4, which is engineers, engineering technologists, many of both on my team. Architects, not so common, but they are eligible. Architectural technologists, I have several on my team. Those 4 in Ontario are governed by provincial legislation that talks about their code of ethics and their standard of behavior and insurance coverage and things like that. And so they're legislative titles and professions. The accredited appraisers are also allowed in Ontario to conduct reserve fund studies. I don't know of any appraisers that do that. They're just simply too busy doing their main scope of work, their main bread and butter is appraising properties and so on. But they are eligible to do it. Real Estate Institute of Canada CRPs, that stands for Certified Reserve Planners. It's a course taken and administered by the Real Estate Institute of Canada. There are several CRPs who are doing a great job out there, and I do still see lots and lots of studies prepared by CRPs. This is an interesting one, Ryerson Bachelor of Technology, Architectural Science, either building science or architecture grads. First of all, the Ryerson as a university doesn't exist now. It's called Toronto Metropolitan University. And secondly, the Bachelor of Technology program no longer exists. It's now Bachelor of Architecture. And building science doesn't exist as a subsection anymore. I can tell you how this got into the Ontario legislation. My good friend Ted Deniston and I were on the legislative change body for reserve fund planning with Peter Leong, among others, back in the late 80s. And we just simply said, there's a good example of a program, but we didn't realize it would ever make it into the legislation as a category of people to do it. We were just giving examples of. So that was kind of funny. And then the final one that they list in the legislation are the professional quantity surveyors. I'm a member of the Ontario Institute of Quantity Surveyors, and I know that they don't have any interest, just like the appraisers. They're just too busy doing their main bread and butter. So these 4, they all govern themselves to their association membership requirements, except of course for the university, they don't have it at all, not even on their radar. So, but the appraisers, CRPs, and quantity surveyors all have their standards and so on that they govern themselves to. So that's the prescribed persons, and like so many things, when you just define who can do something, it's often a good idea to say who cannot. And so that's probably more important. So anybody who has a conflict, whether it's perceived or actual, should not do your reserve fund study for you. And so that includes owners, directors, officers, managers, and their relatives from conducting a study for a particular property. Yeah, often you'll get a very active board member who's just recently retired and he's a professional engineer, and he wants to do the study for the corporation because after all he knows best, and it's free, and you say, well, you just point to these sections of the regulations and say, well, actually you're not allowed to, you have a conflict. So it's interesting when you run across those people, and of course then they're the toughest ones when you do get the draft study. They're going over it with a fine-tooth comb and challenging every number and every multiplication effort that you make. So when to do them? Well, I hinted at that earlier on. Here we go. So when to do them? Every piece of legislation has a minimum prescribed time. In Ontario, it's every 3 years. Alberta, every 5 years. A couple of other jurisdictions every 5 years. I think the Strata Corporation's depreciation reports is on a 5-year cycle. It's a good idea that if something in your asset inventory has changed dramatically, that you should probably redo your reserve fund study, because this may affect the amount of contributions that you have to collect in order to afford future major repair and replacement of that new or changed asset. One of my favorite examples of this is one of my staff called me up and said, John, there is no swimming pool at this corporation. And I said, what do you mean? She said, well, the previous report talked about the swimming pool. It's got pictures of the swimming pool, but there is no swimming pool. I'm here right now. And I said, well, that's very strange. Maybe there's somebody on site that can help explain where the swimming pool went. And said, well, I think it might be under the tennis court. And I said, oh, what did we say about the tennis court in the previous plan? Well, there's no mention of the tennis court in the previous plan. So I think that's a pretty good deduction on your part, as the swimming pool got filled in and the tennis court got installed. Typically, tennis courts are a little bit less expensive on an annual basis than swimming pools for major repair and replacements. So maybe there's a little bit of savings to be had, but this corporation waited until the 3-year mark to let us know. And their response was quite cute too. Oh, we didn't think that would really matter. And it's like, yeah, you didn't think at all. Never mind, it really mattered. So after there's been significant changes, and of course the reverse could happen. You could add something to your assets that might have a big impact. So take your time when you're doing a big project to say, is this properly reflected in our plan? Another time to really think about when you need to do your reserve fund study updates is when the fund balance is really low, or for some reason very different from the forecast. And I would say 50% would be a good guideline. So if a study called for a closing balance of $1 million and you've only got 500,000, it's time to reevaluate whether or not your plan's still on track. Less than that, you probably have good reasons for a slight difference. And of course, more than that, you probably want to think about even harder, like what are you ignoring, or what have you gotten done so much cheaper than predicted? Because usually if you get so much cheaper, there could be a problem. So that's usually related to when expenses are a lot higher than forecast. If your expenses are a lot higher, well, I'm getting an error message here, something about battery saver mode. I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pause here for a second, and I'm going to plug in my laptop just to make sure it doesn't go dead while we're talking. So just give me a second.
Everything sees okay on this end. So
is it okay? Well, yeah. Gerry, maybe you can keep them entertained with a story about your visit to the zoo, and I'll just plug in and make sure everything's okay.
All right. Well, I don't know if I have much to say about my visit to the zoo, but yeah, it was a couple of years ago, and I know I just wanted to say we do have a question about whether we can get a copy of the presentation or the summary of it, and that should be fine. This is also being recorded, so you can get a recording of it, but I'll talk to John about that when he fixes his technical difficulty. But I would really like to encourage questions, actually, because, and I'm sure that some will come up. I mean, I have several written down already that have come up in my head as John's been talking. So you doing better there, John?
I believe so.
Okay. Hey, one quick question. I think the answer is yes, but we have a question about whether a copy of the presentation can be provided.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. We'll make sure that is provided. And then sometimes in the Q&A, we might realize that one of the slides wasn't as clear as it could be. And I'll make that clarification and then PDF it and get it out so it can be distributed to the attendees.
Yeah, I was just saying, I really like to encourage people to ask questions in that Q&A box. We'd be happy to have them. So,
Okay.
all right.
All right, now that I'm plugged in and less likely to run out of battery, well, impossible to run out of battery, we'll get back on track here. So I talked about when expenses were a lot higher than forecast would give you a very low closing balance. Something my wife taught me a long time ago was you spend more than you have, your balance goes down. So now the reverse can also happen where expenses are a lot less than forecast. And you've got to really ask yourself, are we doing the right thing? Did we actually implement the full scope of work that was anticipated by the plan? And did the plan have the right scope of work in it to begin with? Everybody is usually jumping around cheering and happy, especially these days when tenders come in less than the estimate. I'd love to know if anybody got one of those. I haven't gotten one yet so far this year for a lot of reasons that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. So what's involved in it? Well, really two things, right? You actually have to do the physical analysis of your common elements and the financial analysis. In the physical part, we actually establish an inventory of what are all your common element assets. And that's usually related to things like site work, the structure of the building envelope, the enclosure, walls, windows, roofs, that sort of thing. The mechanical systems, the plumbing systems, the electrical systems, life safety systems, if your building is of that size and type. Elevating devices, again, if you're a high-rise building, and even some not so high-rise buildings now have elevating devices in them just to accommodate aging in place. And then things such as a wide variety of interior finishes, if you have lobbies and corridors and things like that. So all of those go into your inventory. And then we establish a cost to replace as of the date of the study. I can tell you that the costs that we were estimating last year in 2021 were a lot less than what we're estimating now in 2022 because of all of the inflation pressures on doing work in occupied buildings, which are much greater than the consumer price index. So that's gone up quite a bit. I hope to see a leveling of it. And we saw a glimmer of hope with the announcement from the American Federal Reserves there. The July number was still very high at some 8%, but less than the 9.5% predicted. And if that trend continues, then they should be back on track by the end of the year. And usually where the Americans go, Canadians follow fairly steadily, maybe a lag by a month or so. The year of acquisition is pretty easy. That's when did you get the common element that we're looking at. So if it's like a tractor or a gazebo out in the yard, well, when, right? So because that affects how much, what the time of replacement will be, because all of these things have an expected useful life. And so once you know when you had it and what the remaining life is, then you would know the estimated year for replacement. So that's what I call the longevity side of things. Get all of that worked out of the way. The financial analysis builds on the cost part here and looks at what you have right now in your opening balance. And the example I'm going to give today is actually a brand new corporation that starts out with $0. What are your annual contributions? And then we predict from there what they need to go up by. What are your likely interest earnings? This is an interesting one. It's a real catch-22 in these strange times we live in. Our safe investments are tied pretty closely to consumer price index. So they're usually just about a 1/4 percentage point, maybe 1/2 percentage point above CPI. So with high CPI came a chance in these last few months to actually get some better investments earning, 2 3/4 and then 3 3/4 and 4 3/4% and things like that, if you had the money available to invest at the time. That will level off and decline again back to next to nothing. The predicted expenditures is the big thing. These are predictions that are based on a wide variety of factors. Hopefully you have quotes in hand if there's big projects to be accounted for in your reserve fund plan over the next year or so. Hopefully you have quotes in hand from contractors to do the work. and understand the scope of work really well. If not, hopefully you have similar projects nearby that can be a factor in estimating. If not, then you'll probably be relying on people like us, the professionals, to look at what you have to do and draw on as much information as possible and get that in there. And then finally, if that doesn't come to pass very well, then you can look at book values from resources such as RS means and a wide variety of other cost sources here and there. But the big three are quotes in hand or completed work. Then, of course, once you take your opening balance, add in your contributions and your interest, take out your expenditures, that leaves you with a closing balance, rinse and repeat for 30 years at least, and you have your cash flow plan. It's next year. So all of these things are predicated on realistic rates of change. So I wanted to talk with you about, so here's your cash flow plan, 30 years. Remember I said this corporation's brand new, they're starting with nothing. They're making, what I would consider to be an extremely minimal contribution of $82.45 per unit per month, which works out in this condo corp's face about $75,000. They're not planning on spending very much. The cost of the reserve fund study itself comes out of reserve, and I think there was a couple of other allowances in here for the first year, so some broken windows and things like that. And then a small interest earnings resulting closing balance go on to the future, right? But all of these things are related to what kind of rate of change should there be in the annual contribution line, the spending line, and the interest earnings. They're not all the same. If you have a plan where they're all the same, you have a poorly prepared plan, in my opinion. And I don't mean to slight any of my colleagues who maybe do it that way, but I really think if somebody is still using the very, very outdated method of, oh, it's all CPI, don't worry about it, it comes out in the wash, it isn't and it doesn't, and you should worry about it because that's not a good plan. So if you don't have three different rates of change for these three things, really rethink what your strategy is. Thankfully, interest earnings, no plan is based on interest earnings being, the be all and end all. I will say there was a caveat about a year ago. A corporation in Saskatchewan got talked into investing in cryptocurrency. I believe it was either Ethereum or Bitcoin, but anyway, it was a cryptocurrency of some sort, because all they had to do was put in $50,000 and they would earn so much interest that they'd never have to contribute again. Well, that didn't come to pass. As of April and May of 2022, all of those cryptocurrencies crashed, and the $50,000 that was put in was pretty much lost. And anybody who's done crypto investments knows how difficult it is to get practical money. You can have digital money and you can do digital transactions, but that's pretty hard to deal with a plumbing contractor who's just replaced 50 toilets and say, hey, do you accept Bitcoin? I can guarantee you the answer is no. I might cut you a break on the HST if you give me cash, but other than that, just cash, please. So interest, if your plan is predicated on earning a lot of interest, then it's probably not a good plan. And you can see some of the numbers here climb really high, but that's relative to the very high closing and opening balances. Spending changes a lot. And this is based on labor, material, and equipment of doing work in occupied buildings. So notice I emphasized labor, material, and equipment of doing work in occupied buildings. So that's the real drivers behind the cost. And if somebody says to you that's close enough to CPI, they're just simply wrong. And I'll show you why they're wrong. It's greater than CPI because CPI has in it a basket of goods, things like broccoli and movie tickets and so on, that just has no impact at all on doing work in occupied buildings. And the three components, labor, material, and equipment, have been changing dramatically over the last couple of years, labor in particular. It's very difficult to get work done in an occupied building by a carpenter when he's got an opportunity down the road to work on a federally funded bridge as a carpenter at union rates and so on. So in order to attract that worker, restoration contractors are paying union rates. And a lot of those unions have just renegotiated their contracts, whether it's carpenters or electricians or plumbers. They've all renegotiated their labor contracts in the last year. And this has been a time of very high consumer price index. And so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy: high consumer price index, high labor rates, and they're not going to drop their labor rates down when the CPI goes down. So they just might not get as big an increase a few years from now. And so you'll often see and hear reserve fund planners talk about a new bar being set, a new level having been reached, because this strange time with such a large influence of things has just caused a dramatic increase. I think that bar will settle out in around the 5% range by the end of the year, but that's my gut reaction. It's just based on looking at what labor contracts have been settled in and for what amounts they've been settled in and stuff like that. Material, I mean, for a little while there during the pandemic, try and build a wood deck, you basically couldn't unless you were willing to invest a fortune into it. So thankfully, the wood mills are starting to catch up. The supply is there again. Some of the tariffs have been lifted in the North American free trade environment that the government was able to sort out. So some of the wood products are getting back on track, but again, they didn't go back to pre-pandemic pricing. They're just a little bit less of an increase. Other materials that are going to be a real bugaboo over the next few years are things like glass products and tinted glass and metal. Glass products, oddly enough, despite the amount of sand we have in the world, the actual production of glass from silicate, sand, has been a challenge. High quality silicate is hard to come by and hard to extract, and it's becoming very expensive. That translates to the end consumer having to pay more for glass and wait longer to get it. Tinted glass and tinted colored metal is a real problem, because in Texas, we had a huge factory that manufactured tint for just about everything, whether it was car paint or window tint or spray applied coatings. So if you wanted a special tint, a special blue or a special brown, that came pretty much from that factory in Texas, and it burned to the ground in 2020. And it still isn't up and 100% operational. And I don't know if they will invest. I believe it was a DuPont company. I don't know if they will invest as heavily in having one location doing so much. They might actually be on a course of having several locations providing, supplying several different markets. So we'll see how that goes. And then finally, equipment. We didn't, during the pandemic, invest in equipment. And so we're way behind on good quality equipment. Some of the swing stages, we had a project shut down because swing stages were just in such bad shape that our guys refused to go on them, and the contractor couldn't get any sort of certification done. So he had to take those swing stages down and go looking for new ones. He couldn't find new ones. He's doing some sort of repair job. Hopefully it's not a MacGyver job, but he's doing some sort of repair job to the equipment he has, and he's going to get it certified by somebody. And hopefully that project will be back on track soon. So these are all some of the things that have resulted from the pandemic that nobody could have foreseen. Nobody during the initial stages said, oh, by the way, we're going to have a really hard time with equipment doing work. Nobody cared. I shouldn't say nobody cared. The property managers cared, because they were trying to get work done on buildings and were scratching their head saying, how come it was so easy a few months ago to get a guy with a swing stage and now it's so difficult? So once again, good job, property managers, for keeping your fingers on the pulse. So those are the big three things. I'll just repeat them. The rate of change for annual contribution, the rate of change for your spending, and the rate of change for your interest earnings should all be specific to your locale and, objective and verifiable. The annual contribution one is a little bit weird. Everybody wants that to be CPI. And I get it, that's a noble goal. But like this corporation, they're just starting out and they're already contributing too little. That was set up deliberately by the builder because he's such a great builder. You don't need to spend as much on buildings. And then people like us come through and say, well, a brick is a brick is a brick. It doesn't matter how good the builder was that put it in. It still costs money to do. And you have these increases to your contribution. Now, some people say to me, well, why is it front end loaded 45%? Well, 45% in this case is $37. And then you look at the end and say, well, it's those people are getting off easy. Well, no, they aren't. They're also increasing by $37. Now, I will accept the economic argument that $37 today is worth more than $37 in the future. I understand that. But I also think that new buildings and many condominium corporations that are facing the next round of expensive repairs do have the time to build up their reserve. And so instead of having multi-million-dollar balances in the first 3 or 4 years, we've got that off well into the 10 to 15-year mark. So it's a strategy. It's a strategy that not everyone agrees on. And if you read the strict wording of some legislation, like the Ontario legislation, where it says your reserve fund has to be adequate in the next fiscal period, full stop, doesn't continue on any further than that. They don't define adequate, but they do say the next fiscal period. That would suggest a one-time increase. And as you can imagine, that would be many hundreds, times, and 7 times in this case. I don't think that was the spirit of the act. It certainly wasn't my understanding at the time. I always understood it to be, not negative. You wouldn't have to borrow money or special assess to get the work needed done. And you'll see in this plan, there are no special assessments, and there certainly are no negative closing balances. Way out in the 60-year mark, there might be, but in the first 30 years, there aren't. And so that rate of change, it's a desirable goal. I get it. Everybody wants it to be CPI. I would suggest that if you're anywhere close to CPI plus a few percentage points, you're on track. But that all depends on each individual corporation's circumstances. And let's delve a little bit more into it. So if you look closely at the groups of years, you want to see numbers that are manageable. Some people would say, hey, 37.5% is not manageable, but look at the long term, 3.2. We know that the consumer price index range is deliberately set by the Bank of Canada to be between 1% and 3%. So in the long term, this will be just slightly over the CPI target range of 3.2%. And if some projects do come in less or don't need to be done as frequently as expected in the plan, then that number will change as updates get done. Interest earnings. In the long term, you're probably going to be able to get close to inflation, a little bit more than inflation, but not much. In the short term right now, I wouldn't bank on it, even though I did mention higher rates earlier in the presentation. Those will be for relatively short times and are dependent on whether or not you have the money right now to invest. So corporations that do have the money right now to invest, in other words, do not have large projects on the horizon and do have a decent opening balance for the next few years, should be looking long and hard at trying to capitalize on those 4% type targets and ladder them over, say 4 times a year or 3 times a year. Make sure you invest. And I would strongly encourage every corporation, whether you have the money or not, to have a long, hard look at what's readily available now in the guaranteed investment certificate area, as they're called market linked or stock indexed, or you pick the name. Each financial institution has their own name for it, and they're linked to the market. So you wouldn't normally, as a condominium corporation, be allowed to invest in the market, but using these GICs, you're not risking your principal at all. You might be risking a very, very low rate of return, but you're not risking your principal. And the upside is you could get a decent rate of return. I personally had one come mature in February of this year, and its rate of return over the course of 5 years was just shy of 11%, which was a little bit more than CPI over that same time frame. I've got another one that looks like it's going to come in a little bit closer to 15%. So that's almost 3% a year. So, those are good investments and they're fine for condominium corporations. Don't let the words market linked or fund linked or anything like that scare you off from doing a good investment. And then the expenditure price, well, these are difficult to do. I mean, we've got 1 year in here at 20 some odd percent and the others at more reasonable levels. And as I said, around about the 5%. So I think over the next few years, we're going to get, this particular plan shows 6.7 and then 3.7. That's going to hover in around the 5% for the next few years. So make sure that the expenditure price index is related to something called the Apartment Building Construction Price Index, which is available through StatsCan. And it's broken down by census metropolitan areas, CMAs. And those CMAs help a lot, because sometimes you'll see Toronto prices escalating for reasons completely different than Windsor prices or Vancouver prices or Calgary prices, even Fredericton. And some of the CMAs do perform differently than others, and sometimes in the opposite direction, especially in resource-based economies like Saskatchewan and Alberta, where you can have a downturn for reasons completely unrelated to all the other manufacturing-based or resource-based provinces might have. Your assumed interest rates, if you use the Bank of Canada 5-year GIC rates, but do what I said, invest in those GICs that are market linked, you should be able to do better than what the plan calls for. And then your annual contribution increases will start to get near the top end of the consumer price index range. You'll recall before the pandemic that CPI was dropping dramatically. In fact, there was talk of a recession before the pandemic. When the pandemic hit and we deliberately went into a recession and started using lots of government funds to have people stay home. And now we're still in that, coming out of it, on the other side of the pandemic. We feel like we're coming out of it. And we also have a real recession facing us. I mean, technically it's been 2 quarters now of contraction. So that's the definition of a recession. There's a lot of other factors at play that still cause prices to go up a little bit, a lot in some cases. So people say recession, what recession? Well, don't worry, by November you'll say, oh, that recession. So it'll come home to roost eventually. So if you can keep track of those 3 things, or if your planner is keeping track of those things for you, then you're good. There's so many assumptions. You got to remember that these are constantly moving targets, and it's not a good idea to set it and forget it. It's much better to update more frequently, or at least in accordance with the local legislative requirements. I'll just reiterate that the worst assumption you can have is if the cost of work in your plan in occupied buildings somehow matches the consumer price index. It just simply doesn't. It's much closer to the apartment building construction price index and the cost of labor. Just reiterate that the consumer price index has stuff in it that it has nothing to do with a reserve fund study. Broccoli mortgages, fuel, sofas, t-shirts, concert tickets. Those things have no impact on doing work in an occupied building. It is the labor, material, and equipment costs of doing work in your occupied building that matter. And those big 3 have changed a lot in the last couple of years. So I chose, just for central location, I chose Ottawa. In Ottawa for the last 30 years, the expenditure price index has been equal to or greater than inflation 21 times out of 30, 70% of the time. So 70% of the time, the cost of doing work in occupied buildings has been greater than inflation. In 2021, the escalation was outrageously high, and there was a lot of factors: the pandemic recovery, the Ukraine-Russia war, and the overall CPI, which petroleum products can have a dramatic effect on both labor and material. It's only been less on a few occasions: 92, 93, that group of years, 95 to 97, 09, 13, 14, and 16. These are economic events that nobody could have predicted. Combined Canadian and US recessions. I'll go out on a limb. I'll predict that we will have another Canadian and US recession over the next few months that may have a slight adjustment. In 2009, there was the subprime mortgage, and that was just a fiasco that, huge financial institutions dramatically changed the way debt was handled and managed. And it had an impact not just on the United States, but on Canada and to a certain extent around the world. In no small measure, this fiasco from that time frame is part of the rationale as to why in Canada we have those stress tests where, sure, you can borrow money, but you have to borrow that, you have to be able to repay that money as if it was expensive money, even though you can get a deal for less. You have to have the income to afford to pay it for less, for more interest rate. And then 2013-14 global debt crisis. And I'm sure when I do this presentation in a couple of years, I'll be talking about the 2021-22, whatever name we decide to give it, the pandemic recovery or whatever. So what does that look like graphically? Because if you're anything like me, words don't mean as much as symbols. So you can see here that we look at every groups of 5 years, so 5, 10, 15, 20, up to 30 years ago. And you can see this is the consumer price index and that's the expenditure price index. You can see that from 2020 to 21, it's 3.5%. And when I update this graph at the end of this year or early next, that's going to be much closer to 8 or 9% that first year. So the expenditure price index, though, was 24% in that same time frame. So again, labor, material, and equipment matter a lot in your plans, 24% just from 2020 to 2021. And so obviously it's grotesquely higher. The delta between these two, it's much higher in favor of EPI. So all these red boxes are years when the EPI was higher. Blue boxes are years when the EPI was a little bit less. And you can see, even when it is a little bit less, it's not that much less. But when it's higher, it's a lot higher. Right? So it's important to recognize that those types of things are just, when it comes to reserve fund planning, absolutely dwarfed by the labor, material, and equipment cost changes. So we mentioned earlier that the other CAI, the Canadian Institute of Actuaries, did a report and that I had supplied the data for it. We complete about 180 reserve fund studies a year. So we took a look at the 300 some odd that we had done up to that point when we had started the study. And I believe we decided that would be a December 31, 2020 cutoff. So we spent most of 2021 analyzing and getting the wording down for the publication, and the publication is February of 2022. So what did we find? Well, we looked at Ontario condo fees, not the fees themselves, but the reserve contributions, and looked at it by decade. And the newer condos, like the one I showed you earlier, had relatively low fees with the average just shy of $4,000. I think it was $3,900. Sort of the typical 1 standard deviation, 2 standard deviations, and then a few outliers. And that's literally one building. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 outliers from average. So that is, this very graph is what generated the title of this presentation, Not Your Average Reserve Fund Study. Most people want to talk about these ones, the outliers, and they forget to talk about the ones that are the majority of the market. And a little bit older, the ones built in the 2000s, so pre-2010, and then a little bit older, you can see that the average is slowly climbing, and it peaks here in those ones from the 80s and 70s, and then dives again for those few that were registered in the 60s. To be fair, there's not very many of these data points, so that may be a little bit skewed just by a small number. But you can see the general trend is upward as buildings age, and eventually in this time frame around $5,000 per unit per year. So you could divide by 12 if you want the monthly contribution. And if that trend holds, and we don't see any reason why it wouldn't, a few years from now when we're doing this presentation again and talking about those buildings built in the 2020s, well, then there'll be another box on here and all of these numbers will have jumped up a little bit, or scale will have changed down this side. You can really see the influence. My co-author on this study, his name is Jean-Sébastien Côté, and he's very French Canadian, and French is his first language, English is mine. So the two of us had a great time trying to understand each other, but you can see that he created this chart because he's using the French standard of putting the $sign after the number. So I always get a smile when I see that. What else did we find out when we did this analysis? That construction typically escalates across the country at rates greater than inflation. So I mentioned that these census metropolitan areas, can be looked at, and we tracked 5 of them, 2, 4, 6, 7, 6 of them, because this is the average here. Sorry, I'm pointing at my screen instead of your screen. So we tracked these ones: Toronto, Halifax, Calgary, Montreal, Edmonton, Ottawa, Gatineau, and Vancouver. They all track very similarly. Sure, some of the peaks are a little bit different, like Calgary had a real peak during that 2008 timeframe, whereas some of the troughs, might have been deeper troughs for other areas, like the Vancouver area had a very deep trough compared to Calgary. But they all came up and down their sorts of ranges. And, people say to me, well, what does that mean? And I get back to my criticism of those people who say, well, the cost of doing work in occupied buildings is related to CPI. Well, CPI is supposed to be 2%. If I put a 2% line on this graph, it should be a little bit bellied. It should go a little bit because it is compounding, but it would have gone up here considerably less than this. And don't forget, this is a cumulative effect. This isn't a one-time, oh, it's only 120 basis points. No, this is a cumulative effect. It's increased again and increased again from those timeframes. So as a result of doing that study, we came up with some recommendations. We believe quite firmly that legislative bodies across the country should be establishing both minimum annual contributions and minimum balances. Now, how that's decided, there's many opportunities for how that's decided. It could be measured on a per square foot basis. I think that's a little bit too granular. I think it should be on a per unit basis. It could be measured on things like relative to the value of the insured value of the corporation, which Quebec has embarked on. If your appraisal in Quebec comes in at $12 million, then you have to put a minimum of 0.5% of that value into reserve every year. I might have the 0.5 wrong, it might be 0.05. It's some fraction of the appraised value. So those are great guidelines. So at least the minimum is established. I will say that just as I'm critical of my colleagues who think CPI and EPI are the same, I'm critical of legislation like Ontario's that says, oh, just put in 10 or 20% of operating. We've shown for far too long that operating costs can be manipulated in the new construction environment, especially when it comes to leasing things. Any property that has a leased heating system, multi-billion-dollar heating system, it's being leased. You find out that 10 years down the road, you still owe many millions of dollars just to buy it because you've only been paying the bare minimum under the lease because the developer set it up that way. And guess what? The developer's leasing it to you. And so he's set to make all kinds of money 10 years down the road. And, you got to get out of that somehow. And it doesn't change the fact that those leased units do need to be repaired or replaced, and that money has to come out of reserve. But your operating cost looks lower because you're leasing it. That's the very reason that I lease my vehicle. I drive it hard and into the ground because I drive so much. But that's a personal choice. A corporation like a condominium corporation should be looking long and hard at that. If their contributions to reserve are based on a percentage of operating, and a big chunk of your operating is, deliberately and manipulated down to the lowest level, you might be missing out on an opportunity for large savings. So 10, 20%, pick any percent. If your reserve contributions are related to a percentage of your operations, you're not off to a good start. You want that independent reserve fund study done. And balances. When I do a reserve fund study, I insist on no less than $500 per unit in reserve. Just too much can go wrong. Too many things can happen that can cost at least $500 a unit. Like I mentioned front doors. It's pretty hard to get a front door for $500 a unit. But something like that, or there can be a legislative change. So many of the property managers in the audience will remember, shift jammers in elevators, for a short period of time. Every shift jammer had to be changed or installed in elevators. It turned out not to be true. It took a class action lawsuit to happen. But everybody was panicking and running around trying to get an elevator company to put in shift jammers, and they were charging whatever they wanted for it because it was basically there weren't enough of them to do the jobs, and they realized that they had a cash cow, and they were just saying, yeah, $1 million, or do you want to replace all your elevators? You're only a few years away from that anyway. So that it became a legislative nightmare and unnecessary cost. So those balances are important to look at and make sure you have the money to weather storms like that. That gets me to the second point and the second recommendation in the CIA report, which is make sure there's a financial cushion. $500 in a very well thought out and very well prepared plan is probably okay. But I've had clients come to me and say, no, that's too low for us. We want it to be $2,000. And then I've had other clients, one in particular who I'm thinking of, came to me and said, you know what, we've only had one special assessment in this corporation, and that was for $30,000. We never want that to happen again. So we want the minimum the minimum balance in any year to be no less than $30,000 per unit, which gave them an outrageously high minimum balance of something like $6 million, because they're roughly a 20-unit condo, very high-end luxury and all that sort of stuff. But I said to them, I said, I think you're needlessly keeping owners' money in an account that really can't earn much in the way of earnings or anything like that. So we're talking to them about changing that and maybe splitting the difference, or giving them some comfort that the plans that we prepare are reasonable plans. So we'll see if we have any luck there. But a financial cushion is a good idea to have. Nobody's perfect, and you don't want to be imperfect in the wrong direction. If you're imperfect, you want to be just, oh, well, we ate into our closing balance. The other thing too is typically minimum closing balances only occur once or for a very, very short period of time in a reserve fund plan. And so you will typically have lots of money in other years from that. And then the other one to consider in these strange times, something that sort of dropped from the headlines recently, is insurance deductibles. Oftentimes, repairs and replacements to common elements are made by way of an insurance claim. A freak storm, a windstorm, a hailstorm, and all the siding got ruined, all the roofing got ruined, wildfire, that sort of thing. And the insurance company, they just say, okay, sure, we'll cover your loss, we'll increase your premium in the future, and they'll do the work. And they'll do the work not to the best quality, they'll do it to the person that's next on their list of contractors to do the work. And contractors, the ones I know, all love to get that kind of work because it's very profitable. And so I'm not so sure that condominium corporations shouldn't be taking a slightly different approach and saying, maybe we should have a minimum balance in reserve that's 2 or 3 times our deductible, and then make a business case decision. Do we want to have another chargeable claim on our insurance record, or do we just want to simply pay for this thing? We know we have the money because our minimum balance is 2 or 3 times our deductible, and if it's not outrageously higher than that, then maybe spend the money out of reserve. One caveat though, it has to be for major repair and replacement of common elements. It can't be for other insured events like, financial fraud or anything like that. Just strictly the property damage, the property and collision P&C part of your insurance. So have a close look at that. And in many cases, you can let your insurance company know that that is the strategy of the board, show them the resolution of the board that they'll be doing that. And you might actually get a little bit of a break on your premium because they see that you have a plan in place to mitigate claims. So, remember before the pandemic and even in the early part of the pandemic, there were corporations that were struggling to even get insurance, never mind get affordable insurance. Thankfully, the Insurance Bureau of Canada has rectified that, and everybody can get insurance now, although it's still debatable as to whether it's affordable. The third point in the CAI report is we need more data. It's great that this report is out there now, and it's great that I'm talking to audiences about it and so on, but that's pretty narrow view of the Canadian market. One engineering firm and one report done by the Canadian Institute of Actuaries. We need a bit more data collection. We certainly need a lot more analysis, and then we need to share that information. Property managers are pretty good about sharing information with boards about, yes, the rest of the portfolio we manage, this is sort of typical, or you guys are atypical because, and fill in the blanks, you have 24/7 concierge service and that car wash service and so on. So your prices are going to be a little bit higher and so on. So we do need to do a bit more of that, and I'm happy to talk to anyone who has ideas. I know Gerry and I have had a few exchanges on some of the ideas that we want to do. And then finally, education, things like this. And the CAI in particular, the Community Association Institute Canada chapter, is doing a fantastic job about educating its members. And I really laud the efforts of the CAI and CMG and other property managers that are doing a great job of making sure the very most current and the very best information is available to the communities that we are all involved with on a day-to-day basis. So that's where we're at. And in sort of summary, you can see that reserve fund studies can't be done just based on the average. You can't just have, the average is this, and so therefore mine should be that. It's good information to know and have. It's a great analysis in the background, but it shouldn't be your target. Your target should be one more piece of data going into that data stream for analysis and sharing. So I hope you all enjoyed that presentation. I know it's a lot to take in and it's very high level. If you have questions, I'm sure Gerry's already monitored a few of them.
Yeah, and we've got questions.
Okay, great.
So first, I think thanks for that, John, and you get extra fries tonight for not confusing CAI, CIA, and CMG and everything else. You got it all right.
There's a lot of 3-letter acronyms, and I did rehearse, by the way.
You did great. So yeah, let's jump into some of the questions. So when you were having your little issue with your battery there, I'd asked for questions and people have delivered. Now you've answered a few of them along the way too, but we'll go over it quickly anyway, for the ones you've already answered. So one person's asked, and I have a quick idea about this, are the recent levels of inflation reason enough to review the reserve fund study earlier than scheduled? And the quick thing I would say, just in my experience, is if you have windows and doors on that list coming up in the next year or two, yeah, it might be. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, my thoughts are very much along the same lines. Only if you have a large project planned before your next, legislated update requirement, or for any of those other reasons that I gave, if your balance is uncomfortably low or the expenses are coming in a lot higher. But just the headline itself that's not good enough. But if you do have projects that may be affected by labor, material, and equipment costs being outrageously high, then yeah, you probably want to look at it. But I would do it in the other order. I would get the quote, even if it's just a courtesy quote. We're not actually tendering this right now, but could you give us an idea of what kind of pricing we're looking at, and then see if that comes close to what the prediction was from a few years before. And I can guarantee you it won't be. It'll be a lot higher. Then build your plan around that. Most corporations, at least the ones I deal with, already have a pretty safe cushion, and so that cushion might be eroded by the higher price, but that doesn't automatically translate into higher contributions, because it may just put your closing balance a little bit later in the plan or something like that. So yeah, it's worth looking at, but not just because of the headline. It's more the headline, and as Gerry said, you have big expensive projects coming up in the next little while, like glass and metal.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I found too. So there's another question here. It was about one of your slides and something you said, and it was about it was your slide on when to think about doing your reserve fund study early. And you'd mentioned that if the closing balance for the year was deviating, or the actual was deviating quite a bit from the projected, you might want to think about. Was it 50% deviation? Correct. You said?
Yeah, 1/2, 50. Yeah.
Okay. Great. All right.
If your closing balance is less than half of what was predicted, or 50% of what was predicted, then probably time to do an update. And vice versa, if your closing balance is, much higher, you want to sort of look at the plan and say, okay, what was planned that was so expensive that we didn't do? And is the not doing of that a good thing? You don't want to find yourself in a situation where you put off $100,000 of work for 5 years only to discover that it's now $1 million. That kind of thinking. We see this happen once in a while. We're struggling with one client right now who does not want to do waterproofing on their balconies. They're about a 20-year-old condo that got a lot of deterioration. We're fixing the deteriorated parts, and we're recommending putting waterproofing on because they got a great price. I couldn't believe the price they got for waterproofing. Right. So, this will save you a ton of headaches in the future. And they're just resisting they're saying, oh no, it's an unnecessary part of the scope of work. We want to keep it to the minimum. It's like, okay, but this decision today is going to cost you a lot more in the future.
Right. And that ties into something you said too, which is that the balance is not the whole story as to the health of the reserve fund. I have seen a few condominiums that have a balance lower than what's projected, but they've done a pile of work that they got great pricing on. So actually they're ahead of the game, even though it looks like they're not, right? So
yeah. That whole perception of well-being, I'd much rather see a condominium corporation that is physically in an amazingly good shape with just a decent closing balance. So in other words, they're not hoarding the money. They're actually making the money work for them by keeping the street value, the curb appeal up.
Right. So this is a tough one, and I'm not sure if we're going to be able to answer this fully, but the question's, how can condos protect against the costs rising faster than the cost of living? So I guess I guess the unit owners are taking money in and they only get so much of an increase per year.
Yeah.
Whereas we're saying, construction can be a lot more than that increase.
Yeah, there's a couple things. First of all, make sure you always, for larger projects, and by larger, I mean, $25,000, $50,000, make sure you get competitive pricing. Establish a scope of work, whether it's a scope of work in conjunction with your property management or going full bore and having a consultant prepare a scope of work and specify the materials and stuff like that. But get competitive pricing. Don't rely on 2 or 3 bids. Try and get 5 to 7 bids. Don't open the door either. You don't want one of these situations where you've got 100 bids and you can't make heads or tails out of it. But some decently competitive pricing, and then look long and hard at that and say, just as these clients I just mentioned, they're looking long and hard at the waterproofing and saying, is that something we absolutely need to do or we want to do? And if it's very much a want, then decide whether or not you even need to do it. Even though I'm arguing with that one client about the benefits of waterproofing balconies, I have another client that came to me and said, "Hey, we got our prices in, and they're quadruple what you called for in the reserve fund plan. How bad a plan are you?" And I said, "Well, let's have a look at the scope of work." And it turns out the scope of work was for many things, not just the one line item for balcony repairs, but it was also for brickwork, brick sills, window sills, the caulking, the storm doors on the balconies. These things were all different line items in the reserve fund plan that nobody bothered to go looking for. They just all focused on the one, the balcony slab repairs. And so when you added up all those numbers, the quadruple was actually only about 20%. But still 20% on a big job is a lot of money. And so we went through it and said, do you really need to do the storm doors? It's $500 a unit, and there's a lot of units. Like, maybe that could be held off for a few years. It's something you can do at any time. You don't have to do it with the balcony work. And by the same token, the caulking work, there was only one window on the balcony, but there was 3 other windows for the most part. Some units were different size, but for the most part, there was 3 other windows outside of the balconies. And I said, I get it. The contractor wants you to do that because, well, the concrete is drying on the balconies. He can be doing the caulking, on the non-balcony windows. I understand the contractor wants you to do it, but from what we saw, it looked like you had a couple more years left in the caulking work. Does it have to be done at the same time as the balconies? And so with those 2 things, those 2 considerations for the scope of work, getting the wants out of your scope of work and just focusing on the needs. So that's one way you can, stave off the effects of inflation. Another way is to consider whether or not you can get into an arrangement with a contractor where there's steady work for the contractor at a steady price, or a steady escalation in price. We have one on the go right now that started during the pandemic, where the contractor said, I'm not going to be able to staff up this job to the extent that I can get it done in 1 year. I would like to work 3 months at the beginning of each construction season for the next 4 years. And he said, and plus with all this craziness of the pandemic and so on, it would make him feel a lot more comfortable that he just had a smaller crew and things like that. The corporation, to my surprise, was okay with it. Now, bear in mind, this means 4 years of chipping and grinding and noise making every spring. And we talked them through all of that. And they said, you know what, that's still better for us because who knows where the prices are going. And I'll tell you, that board must have had a crystal ball better than mine, because within a few months, it was kind of like, holy smokes, did you ever nail it? She's really got that in. And with only I think it was a 5% increase in the 4th year. So, that was a really good decision that they made. That's the second way that you can stave off. And the third way is really looking hard at your investments and see if you can get your laddered investments to offset this crazy time. So I showed that, how much higher is it? Well, it's typically about 2 to 5% higher. So if you can earn 2 to 5% on your savings, especially in years when you're not doing much work and you have a large balance, then that might help offset some of those crazy increases. I don't think we'll ever get the increases down to 0. We'll never have the Bitcoin promise where you can just live off the interest, but you can certainly offset a chunk of it, 1 or 2% of it perhaps, by having wise investments. There aren't very many corporations that are going aggressively after it, but if you have a good plan, set out in in cooperation with your investment advisors and your property management, you'll go a long way to softening the blow of the increases required to your overall common expense fees. So those are three strategies. Every corporation is different. You might have a unique situation that can also help, but generally those are the three that I find.
Yeah, just that actually blends nicely with one of the other questions, which is, does the Act specify what type of investments a corporation may or may not use? I'm just going to stop the question right there. It goes on about the reserve fund, but this is in general. Yes, it does. So there's what's called eligible securities in the Act. John mentioned most of the ones you can buy. And I think there's not much else you're allowed to buy. And I know there was another question about whether there's a movement afoot to change that. John, I haven't heard anything about that, but do you know anything about it?
Yeah, there is a movement afoot. A few of the committees that have been on over the years have really suggested strongly to the governments that be in this, particularly in Ontario. And just to reinforce Gerry's point, Section 115 of the Ontario Condominium Act clearly lays out the eligible securities. So we've been pushing at the committee level, and it's like anything, every committee sets out with the best of intentions to design a thoroughbred horse and end up with a camel. But we've tried our best at the committee level to get governments to ease the restrictions on the eligible securities and go for some of these AAA rated bonds. For example, if you look at Peel Hydro, they sold bonds years ago and their bond has never underperformed. It's always gone up. Even in this market, it's gone up again. So there are some bonds that are good, safe investments. The trouble is, how do you legislate which bonds are good ones? So there was a lot of work by TD Bank and Scotiabank on, here's some possibilities to open up the door to eligible investments. But I get back to my previous point. If you are the type of board that's very cautious and you don't want to lose any principal, then you're looking at guaranteed investment certificates, GICs. And there are some great GIC products out there. And like I said, if you aggressively go after them, even if it's $5,000 at a time, 4 or 5 times a year, 4 or 6 times a year, you're going to do better than most by investing in those market-linked GICs. Every financial institution has some form of market-linked GIC. And unfortunately, there are a few people in the industry who say, oh, no, condos are not allowed to invest in the market. Well, you're not. You're buying a GIC that is linked to the performance of the market. You will not lose your principal. The only risk you're taking is you might not get very much in return. If the market collapses just at the time of maturity, then what you thought you were going to get might not actually transpire. You'll still get something, 0.5% or something like that. But it's worth it. And even if you only do every 3rd or 4th investment in something like that, I'm sure you'll find it pays off.
Great. Okay, so here's an interesting one that's moving away a little bit from the financials, and I'm not sure if this comports with my experience, but I'm looking forward to what you have to say about it. Which is, it says many newer products don't last as long as, I guess, older products did. How can we ensure life expectancy of assets like copper pipe and cast iron are accounted for properly? So I'm not sure. Like, so I think about roofing, I think about plumbing, I think about vinyl siding. I think these things actually kind of last longer than what was used in many cases before. But what's your experience?
So for those of you who don't know, I'm actually on vacation this week, and I'm visiting my my nephew and his sons and wife out in Calgary, or near Calgary. And I've had some very interesting discussions with my 11-year-old great nephew about the perception of things. And we just talked last night about the perception of time. When you're 11 years old, 1 year is 10% of your life. When you're 50 years old, 1 year is 2% of your life. And so a year is 10 times longer for him than it is for me. And it's interesting, that we perceive things as we start to get involved in communities and so on. And we think back to our childhood and we say, the house that I grew up in only ever had 1 roof replacement. But you don't live there anymore. You don't know if they've done 1 or 2 or 3 more, right? So you only perceive that as only ever being needed once in your lifetime. But here you are now looking at a plan that goes out 30 years. And if if the changes come into effect 45 or possibly 60 years. So you're looking at many, many cycles of that. So that same cycle of 23 years just seems to be faster. And so that's part of it. But getting away from the philosophy of the perception of time, I do believe that many of our newer materials do last longer with a few caveats. And of course, the caveats make the headlines. We did have a horrible problem with, say, CAI piping, for example, where the aluminum metal mesh reinforcement in the piping was incompatible with the brass fittings. And so they failed, and they failed in a dramatic way, and to the point where insurance companies said, if you have CAI piping, you have to do something about it. Other things come to mind that, we were promised the world and actually got, a patch of grass. And the roofing shingles in particular, we moved away from the felt and asphalt impregnated felts and so on. Firstly, it was horribly detrimental to the environment, but secondly, petroleum products were up and down like toilet seats, and it was hard to know what the pricing of shingles would be as far as material went. We knew fairly well what the labor would be, but we didn't know what the material would be. So they've changed that. They've gotten away from the paper-backed products, and they have these glass fiber mesh. Glass is not a good term. It's actually a fibrous mesh. So that fibrous mesh, when it's encapsulated properly and not exposed to UV and protected by the coatings and the granular surface, will last 60 years because it's the same product that vinyl siding is made out of. It's just formed in a mesh. And we have many, many examples of vinyl siding lasting 60 years, even if it is exposed to UV. So there's that. And then, you go back and forth, and I'm sure that the person who asked the question could have a long discussion with me about, yeah, but look at this, and it didn't last as long, and look at that, it's lasted longer, and we go back and forth and probably take several beers to agree that there's something in the middle, there's some average there that's appropriate. Now, as reserve fund planners, we tend to be pretty cautious because we're talking about other people's money. So we might put in a 19-year life for something that could last 25. Or might even have some form of warranty or guarantee for 30 years. Don't forget, all of those warranties and guarantees are almost always limited to the product itself, not the labor to do the work. So I agree that it does seem like newer products need work more frequently, but a lot of that is perception. And I think a lot of it too is the labor productivity is different. We used to have fantastic labor productivity because our laborers were younger. Our laborers now are approaching retirement age, and while they have the experience to do things very efficiently, they don't necessarily do a lot more of it. And so that's one of the issues that we're facing in our labor market is baby boomers retiring in record numbers. And many of those baby boomers are in the trades, and the trades are depleting their labor market dramatically. And so to keep a young worker on a swing stage doing caulking work, costs a lot more. And maybe that young worker isn't working quite as efficiently and not doing quite the high quality work that the skilled tradesman who just retired was doing. And so that might be part of the perception of work needing to be done more frequently. And I think we have that reality to face. I mean, we often talk about, many seminars and webinars are talking about aging in place. What about replacing the aged worker? How do we do that? How do we go about getting good, skilled, quality workers on the stage? And I think that will factor in to a greater extent than the actual materials themselves, failing sooner.
So we'll put a budget for cloning into the next reserve.
Yes, yeah. Cloning Joe the bricklayer.
Yeah, exactly. So we're getting close to 1:30, John, where we're gonna have to call it quits, but we'll try to get through some more of these questions. So there was one question about Emilio noticed that in your, I guess it was your cash flow table, your contributions spread over 10 years, then back to the inflation rate. Many reserve fund engineers say you have to catch up within 3 years of the study. And I know you mentioned that the Act says it has to be adequate. Did you want to
fiscal year? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, did you want to go over that again? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. The Act says adequate in the next fiscal year does not define adequate, but does say next fiscal year, which suggests a one-time increase. And then if you agree with the market, and a lot of my colleagues have come to the agreement that adequate means inflation matched. I'm not quite there yet. I certainly do plans that way, but I do also show that we know the cost of doing the work is accelerating faster than the contribution rates, because we're all setting the contribution rates at CPI. And if anyone, picture two cars racing down the racetrack, one's accelerating at 20 kilometers an hour and the other one's accelerating at 30 kilometers an hour. Well, by the time they get to the end of the drag race, the other one is going an awful lot faster than the first one. So, unless you have a huge balance that you can just erode over time, which most corporations don't, you're going to be stuck with increasing it greater than consumer price index, because we know the costs are accelerating greater than the expenditure price index. So in 2021, the PEO, the Professional Engineers of Ontario, issued a guideline for reserve fund planning, and they said, let's do it 3 years, because, well, you have to update every 3 years, right? That's the minimum time or the maximum time between updates is every 3 years. I think that's a great guideline, but it's not really put a lot of thought into the subject matter at hand. What's the difference between 1 and 3? 2. Well, okay, but was there much thought into that? You'll also notice that the slide I shared, I focused more on the dollar amount being closer to $37 than the percentage amount. The percentage amounts were actually declining. The PEO methodology allows you to do 20% 3 years in a row. Well, that's 20% compounded 3 times, whereas the methodology I use would have been 20, 19, and 18 probably. So, that's just a difference in methodology. And then, if you're going to allow 3, why not 4? And if you're going to allow 4, why not 6, and so on down the slippery slope, right? And if you look, we've had experience now with mandated reserve fund studies since 2001. We were given a grace period to get it. Everybody had to have it done by 2004, and then all new condos and existing condos would be in complete compliance, which didn't quite happen, but that was the theory. And that legislation said, by the way, you have 10 years to become adequate. Everybody's kind of forgotten that, because 2014 was almost 10 years ago, and everybody's forgotten that legislation said, oh, you actually have 10 years to become adequate. Well, if 10 years was good enough then, why isn't it good enough now? It's my sort of take on it. And then you look at strange events, and I mentioned a few of them, like the elevator shiv jammers and even the implementation of HST. One of the funny things about our industry was, at the time HST was implemented, we lobbied hard, and we insisted on getting relief in reserve fund planning to extend the horizon from that 10-year horizon to 15-year horizon. And then there was something else that came into being. I forget what it was. It was fire. I think it was fire legislation changed, and it was just outrageously expensive and high to do. And we got another 5 years tacked on. And I'm sure there'll be something else in the future that we'll lobby hard to get changed for. So all of these things just illustrated to me over the years that 10 years is probably okay, as long as you're not going dangerously low in your closing balance, or simply can't afford to not contribute more. And sometimes, if when I look at those 3-year plans, I sort of roll my eyes and say, why don't you just special assess, right? It was only have been a $5,000 unit, and then you could be inflation matched. I don't like that, but I mean, that's really when you compress the contribution increases in to a short period of time, you really ought to start thinking about special assessment. Now, my colleagues will argue with me, and I've had these arguments, thankfully, over beers. And, they'll say, yeah, but John, your compounding over a long period of time ends up costing the future owners an awful lot more than the present owners. And I say, to a certain extent, I have to agree. The math is what it is. And I counter that with saying, well, then if you had planned for your own retirement the way you should have, you as a young person would have been, instead of buying property, contributing an awful lot more to your RSPs, so that you wouldn't have to worry about selling your property in retirement and being able to retire. And they kind of just say, oh, well, now you're just getting into philosophical discussions. And I say, let's order another beer. So it's hard to know where the slippery slope levels off. I think it's around the 10-year mark. I've been doing this for a long time. And I'm becoming a firm believer in it. I'm not a big believer in short is better. I get it. The numbers are lower as a result of doing a short, sudden increase. Yeah, I think if our plans were 60 to 100 years long, then I might have a lot more agreement. But I think you would also find that my colleagues would say, well, that's an awful lot more costing to account for. Maybe we should spread it out over time. So 3 out of 30 is 10%, whereas 10 out of 30 is 33%. You know, it's hard to know which one was better. I think taking the up to 10 years, as long as you can afford to do up to 10 years, then I think you're in a better stead in the long run. Plus, it makes it more manageable from the community point of view. There's upheaval, but not as dramatic an upheaval, and not as much questioning of the board's decision to implement a plan and so on.
Yeah.
So I hope that helps, but it is very much a unique, it's not that unique, there's other planners doing it too, but it is certainly something that we do as planners, that we really try and spread those increases out as long a period as possible.
All right, well, that's interesting. We're going to have to, I think, just have time for one last question, and I'm going to just pick my favorite question off the list of remaining questions. My apologies to everybody that has asked one that we might not get to, but so here it is. So given the building collapse in Florida is a concern for buildings near the ocean, should there be a concern for buildings to account for added reserve fund expenditures because they're near a major roadway in a Canadian city where salt spray can seep into exterior facades or even concrete supports? Is that something anybody's considered?
Yeah, unfortunately, we do have several clients who are experiencing accelerated concrete deterioration even before a surfside collapse, where we were carrying balcony repairs on a 7-year cycle. The good thing, and one of the biggest differences between Canada and the United States, is in Canada, again, with a few jurisdictions, exceptions, but in Ontario in particular, you have to implement a plan for future funding. You can't just ignore a plan for future funding. Now, you can change it at your own peril, but you have to implement it. That's not the case in the United States in all jurisdictions, and they're changing that. I think even Florida has just recently passed some legislation. It's not so much just salt-laden water that's a problem. There's a lot of issues, and concrete deterioration is primarily fueled by a process known as carbonation, where all the products in the air, whether they're salt-borne or not, accelerate an acidic reaction, carbonation, and that adversely affects the embedded steel, which causes rusting. Rust occupies a greater volume than the parent material, and so it pops the concrete off. We call that spalling, and then it just accelerates even faster. And that can be in a salt-laden environment or in the absence of a salt-laden environment. Some buildings, for whatever reason, it doesn't occur as fast, and others, it does occur a lot faster. Anti-carbonation coatings were a thing for a little while until people realized you can't coat every surface, every square inch of the concrete, and until you do that, it's really not an anti-carbonation coating. But it does, those same coatings do a great job of keeping water out. So yeah, I mean, Surfside, don't forget, here in Ontario even, we did have the Algoma Mall in Elliott Lake collapse, very much due to water penetration, and in that case it was steel structure that collapsed, killed 2 people. We've had other collapses that are less headline prone, but we have had parking garage collapses. We've had pieces of walls fall down in Montreal. And these sorts of things do happen from time to time. And thankfully in the condominium environment, there's enough money to address these, and usually enough experience with the planners to say, I don't think it's wise to plan on deferring that much needed work. I think we should at least get in there and do an investigation and decide whether or not we can defer it. So I hope that helps answer the question. It's a great point. I mean, it's something that, every condominium office should have a picture of that Surfside collapse on the wall somewhere, and just have a little in memoriam to remind people that you're not just trying to keep fees low, you're trying to keep asset value high. And I think if more people thought about their reserve fund plan as an investment in their property, some of the decisions would be a little bit different.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, I think that's all the questions we can take. Jon, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everybody for attending.
Yeah,
And again,
subject to it's a subject that I could talk about all afternoon long, even on vacation. So,
well, I'm sure your family appreciates that. So, all right. Well, then with that, thanks to CMG and CAI Canada, and have a nice day, everybody.
have a great day, everyone. Stay safe.